Jesus come. Amen. I hope you're waiting, looking for Christ's return. With anticipation and excitement and not dread. You know, like a lot of things, you've probably noticed, you've been driving for a length of time anyway, that the dashboards on cars have changed dramatically through the years. Many of you probably can remember a time when basically all you had was a speedometer, fuel gauge, pressure gauge, temperature gauge, and probably a voltage meter that was telling you that your battery is being charged, right? Now, maybe your car today may have some of those gauges, probably have a fuel gauge. They may or may not have some of those other gauges. But, you know, when you turn on your key, what? The whole dash lights up with all these crazy colors and images and icons. Of course, when the car starts up, then most of them go off, unless there's a problem. Now, one of those comes on, you probably better check it out and see whether or not there's a serious issue, because some of them could be a serious issue. It's a warning to you that there is a problem. Now be honest, do you really know what half those icons mean on there when they No, not really. Well, the reality is, some of those lights do indicate a serious problem, and if they do come on, then you better check it out. But there's also the reality that some of those lights, not so serious. I got a vehicle from a guy once, and one of the first times I drove it, I noticed there was this little piece of black electrician's tape on the dash. And I thought, I wonder why that's on there. So I took it off, and I just started laughing. Underneath was the automatic braking system warning light. Now obviously ABS system quit working, and he didn't want to spend the money to fix it, but he also didn't want to look at that light flashing at it. So he just covered it up, so he didn't have to see it. Gotta love it. I don't know. They probably hadn't been working for years. I'll guarantee you that piece of tape had been on there for quite a long time. Here's the reality. Like I said, there are some signs, like ABS warning lights, that you could probably ignore. You know, many of us grew up before the days of automatic braking systems. We know how to brake. We know that you need to pump your brakes and this and that. I mean, that's all it does. It just does it for you. So if it quits working, you just use them like the old-fashioned brakes. It's not a problem. But there are other signs of the times that, if ignored, result in dire consequences. One day, as the crowds of people were following Jesus, he cautioned them against ignoring the signs in life that are most important. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12 today. We're going to begin with verse 54, 12, 54 through 59. It goes to the end of the chapter there. Jesus, he said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain. And it does. When the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot. And it is. Hypocrites! You know how to predict the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled to him on the way, or he may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Let's pray. Father God, thank you again for this day. I just thank you that we can gather in this place to worship you as a body of Christ, to just sing songs of praise and worship to you, and gather and to encourage one another. Most of all, to just be in your presence, to sort of sit at your throne of grace and mercy, sit at the feet of Jesus and learn, so to speak. And we thank you for your written word that helps us to do that. We ask for open hearts and minds today, that we would learn what you would want us to learn and be encouraged in those things, be challenged. And thank you, Lord, that you will do that for us. In Christ's name, amen. Now, regardless of where you live, I think we'd all agree it is important to pay attention to the weather, because the weather always affects somebody in one way, shape, or form. That's just a reality. I think we found that out right here a week ago Saturday. That storm that went through affected a lot of people in various ways. Now, I'm not sure if it's quite as common these days, because as we know, most people have easy access to daily weather forecasts, even hourly forecasts, so they can see kind of what the weather is doing. Look at the radar, it's moving over here, it's going to go up there. But you know, that didn't used to obviously be the case years ago. People needed to pay close attention to the weather signs that God gave them in His creation. Perhaps you recall growing up hearing some of the sayings, "Ring around the moon, storm soon." Did you ever hear that growing up? Or maybe you used to hear, "Red sky at night, sailors delight, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning." The other day in the evening, Nancy and I were going somewhere, and she said, "Red skies at night, it's going to be a nice day tomorrow." And yes, it was. In fact, weather-wise, it was a beautiful day. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, you know, you can't just say red sky because that's a whole other discussion. It's not quite as simple as the red sky, okay? There's other factors involved there. But anyway, anyone who obviously lives in Israel knows that the Mediterranean Sea is off to the west. And that's where they get most of their moisture from. So if you see clouds rising up in the western horizon, the western sky, good chance it's going to rain. So, I mean, they knew that. Jesus said, you see it, you know, cloud rising in the west, it's going to rain. You know those things. Also, to the south is a huge desert. If the wind starts blowing from the south, naturally what's going to happen? It's going to blow all that heat from the south, come right in. He says, you know that. The south wind starts blowing, it's going to get hot. You know all those things. Kind of like here in Minnesota. The north wind starts blowing in the winter, what's going to happen? Yeah, it's blowing right off the snowbanks of Canada. It's coming right down at us. It's going to get cold. We know those kind of things. He said, you know that. You know all this stuff. But then, he says, you hypocrites. Well, see, there isn't anything wrong with knowing the weather. I mean, it's good to watch those signs and pay attention to the weather, especially if you live in a culture that's predominantly agriculture, and certainly that was the case with those Israelites during Jesus' time. They predominantly culture, they needed to pay attention to the weather. And he says, you hypocrites, I mean, ouch. Isn't that a little bit harsh? Since there's no problem with predicting and watching the weather, or is it? Was he being a little harsh on them? How is it, he says, that you know how to predict the weather, but you don't know how to predict the spiritual signs of the times that are right in front of your face? Why is that? Well, the main reason they were blind to the spiritual signs is because they deliberately chose not to see them. And that's why Jesus called called them out as hypocrites. I think a rundown of the sign reveals how obvious they were for anyone who was actually looking for them. Galatians 4, verse 4 tells us that when the right time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman. If you go to Romans chapter 5, verse 6, it tells us at just the right time, when we were still sinners, Christ came and died for the ungodly. God has a way of stepping in at just the right time. Have you ever experienced that in your life personally? That at just the right time, God stepped in to your situation? At a time when evil on the earth had reached a climactic level, what did God do? He sent a flood to destroy all the ungodly and start afresh. And when Jesus stepped into our world, once again, morality was at a horrendously low level in the world, and particularly in that culture. Corruption was rampant throughout the whole culture at every level, from the religious leaders all the way down to just the common people. Just as one example, in many places it wasn't even safe to travel during the day. I think most of us are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. After he's out traveling on the road and he gets attacked right in the middle of the day. That's the situation. Things were not good. Jesus, as we think about that Good Samaritan and other illustrations, Jesus always, as he told parables, he always based them on illustrations that listeners could relate to from common, current life experiences. And the most blatant sign that everyone was missing at that time was that the main root cause of their immorality was that everyone, and yes, even the religious leaders, everyone was only giving lip service to God. Their hearts were with God. Their hearts were far, far from God, and few people wanted to look at that sign. Another sign that they turned a blind eye to was the dire political situation. Now, to say that there was serious tension between the Jews and the Romans would really kind of be an understatement. I mean, there was just a serious hatred, a bitter hatred between the Jews and the Romans. Any kind of even a hint of revolt by the Jews instantly prompted a harsh response of the Roman military might. Israel was headed for war. And in fact, it did happen. Within 70 years, the Romans marched into Jerusalem, destroyed the town, burned down the temple. That's where they were headed. But rather than repenting and turning to God before it was too late, they just kept blindly racing down that same path that they were on. They refused to look at the signs around them of where they were headed. And it wasn't that God hadn't, tried, explicitly tried to get their attention. Yeah, he hadn't spoken for 400 years. But who did he send prior to Christ? John the Baptist came. A voice of one calling in the desert, repent! Get yourself right, get ready for the coming of the Lord. heeded his warning. Tragically, the religious leaders responded similar to the way the people did back in Old Testament times, when God would send prophets to warn them. They didn't listen. They even tried to discredit John the Baptist. Said the guy's crazy. Those were all signs of their present time that the people were choosing not to see. But ironically, the most obvious sign of all was standing right there in front of them, speaking to them. They should have been able to easily see in Jesus the power of the Son of God. I mean, other places, they said, wow, we've never heard anyone speak like him. And wow, the miracles and the signs and wonders that he is doing, it's amazing. And still, rather than recognizing who Jesus was, they just continued in their unbelief. Though it was very obvious that Jesus was not like other men, they, again, failed to recognize who he was, and he truly was Messiah, the Son of God, coming to the earth. Their salvation was right there, standing in front of them. God was reconciling the world to himself through Christ. God was offering them peace, and they couldn't see it. Jesus said, why don't you judge for yourselves what's right? In other words, look at the signs, people. What do you see? You're so good at predicting the weather. Why don't you interpret the spiritual signs that are around you? And then Jesus gave them a scenario that should have been a no-brainer to figure out what was the right thing to do. Sure enough, what did he do? He used an illustration that was very common in that culture. Something, an illustration that they would understand, that they could relate to. Now, we don't have the exact equivalent in our own culture. Yeah, it's true. If you don't pay your bills, somebody might sue you and take you to court. But in that culture, if you owed someone some money and you weren't paying your bills in that ancient Jewish culture, they would haul you off to court and they would throw you into what's called debtor's prison. And you would be there till you paid it all back. There was no debt forgiveness once you got into the debtor's prison. Jesus said, if you don't pay your bills, and the person you owe money to takes you to court, do everything you can to take care of your debt before you get to the judge. Because otherwise, as sure as the world, once you get there and stand before that judge, every single penny that you owe is going to have to be paid back. Actually, that amount that Jesus referred to, lepton in the Greek, NIV calls it a penny. Actually, the value of that is half the value of one of our pennies. In other words, absolutely none of the debt that you owe will be forgiven until it is paid off, right to the half cent. So you better appeal to the mercy and the grace of your creditor before it's too late. And that's just plain common sense. Perhaps it's relatively easy for us to see that in that illustration there, Jesus isn't talking about owing literal money. It's not what he's talking about. judge represents God. And the debt we owe is the cost of our sins. The wages of sin is death. There is no amount of good works that we can do on this side of eternity. There is no amount of suffering that we might experience on the other side of eternity that can ever be enough to pay the full amount of the cost of the sins that any one of us have committed. And even if the slightest sin, I'm talking about the smallest thing that you might do, you think, well, that's really no big deal. Even the smallest amount of sin, if it's not covered, then we are sentenced to an eternal separation from God. Jesus is the only solution to our debt problem. As we were kind of going through those signs of the present time of Jesus' audience, did any of those signs sort of kind of jump out as possibly signs that are evident today in our own present culture? Did any of that kind of occur to you? No doubt, right now, we are currently facing a societal moral freefall. We are on a downward spiral when it comes to morality. And tragically, on some of the issues, the church in America is at the front of that downward spiral, leading to pull back. It's time to get back to what's right. And what's right is what's in line with God's character and in line with His written word. I saw a caption recently that is absolutely profoundly true, but also it's unpopular in a growing number of church sermons. This is what it was. It says, Jesus is a friend of sinners, but He is no friend of sin. Say it again. Jesus is a friend of sinners, but He is no friend of sin. Now we like that. That's great, that first right. Oh man, it's great that Jesus is our friend. But don't ever tell me that He may not like my sin. That is a very true statement. Jesus hates sin just as much as God hates sin. Why? Because what does sin do? It separates us from God. And that's why that's why Jesus, knows God, is no friend of sin. Yeah, He's our friend. He came to die for us while we were still sinners, but He is no friend of our sin. So if that's what we believe, that He's okay with our sin, then maybe we need to step back, repent, and have an attitude check. Because He is not okay with our sin. Yeah, He loves us. He came and died for us. But He does not love our sin. Where do we begin with our current political situation? Where do we begin with that? Who would have ever, in their wildest dreams, imagined that we would see a day when our elected officials would be determined to destroy the republic, the very republic that put them into office and put them in power? Who would have ever thought we would ever see that? And whoever thought that we would see the day when they would invest more in overturning a presidential election than they will in dealing with the serious challenges that are facing our nation. Yeah, I'm getting worked up because it is serious stuff. Who can miss those signs? You know what? If we, the people, do not get on our knees and start praying for our nation, we are soon not going to have a nation anymore. And yes, we are at war. I know that's a terrible word, but we are at war today, and it's right here within our own borders. Yeah, I'm worked up. I'm not going to apologize for that. That's okay. I'm not going to apologize for that. People, we've got to look at the signs that are going on around us here. We need to seek forgiveness, people, for what's going on in our nation. We, the people, must look at the signs and do something before it's too late. But all that aside, I'll settle down and read, okay? All that aside, the most important issue is, what are you going to do personally with Jesus? That's what's really important. The reality is, unless Jesus returns soon, there's not a one of us here who are going to get off of this earth alive. That's a reality. When we leave, we're going to have to stand before the judge. And the standard of judgment used to determine if we'll spend eternity with God is not simply better than average. Well, I was better than average. Sorry. That is not the standard that we're going to be judged by. If you're like me, you tend to overstate your righteousness. I do mine. You know, I say things like, well, I'm a good person. You know, I'm certainly not as bad as that person. You ever said that? Have you ever thought that? I was justified in what I did. Actually, it really wasn't my fault. It was their fault. We say all those kind of things, or we think them in our mind, do we not? Even though the evidence is stacked against us, we believe we've done nothing too seriously wrong. But the standard that we'll be judged by is perfection, and Jesus is perfect. That's the standard. And that standard, I believe, should give us pause. You know what? Each day, we are one step closer to standing before the judge. And not just me, but you, and everyone else that's walking the face of this earth. And it only makes sense. It only makes sense that we would accept Jesus before we get there. Before we're thrown into utter darkness where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. A sign that we should never ignore is that none of us know how many days before we'll stand before our Creator and give an account of our life. I believe that should give every one of us a sense of urgency. And not only for ourselves, not just for ourselves, but especially for those whom we know don't know Jesus. If you've ever flown much, I'm sure you're familiar with the little procedural routine the flight attendants go through right before takeoff to explain all the different procedures. They hold up a seat belt and they say, if the seat belt sign is on, you have to have your seat belt on at all times. They show you how to open and close the seat belt. In case there's an emergency landing, the lights will light up along the aisles to show you where to find the exits. Look around, look to see all your exits. Make sure you know where your exits are. In case of a water landing, there's an inflatable life vest. Just pull a cord and it will inflate. But if it doesn't inflate, there's a little tube, you blow it up. And of course, your seat cushion, that can be used as a flotation device. All those kind of things they tell us, right? And then they say, if in case, for any event, the cabin loses air pressure, then an oxygen mask will drop down. The next step is vitally important. They say, before you try to help someone else, make sure you put your oxygen mask on first. Why is that? Because while you're trying to help them, you may both die. Spiritual warning signs are glaringly lighting up the dashboard of our times, folks. Don't cover them up and pretend they're not. The cabin pressure has dropped to a dangerously low level. Have you put on Christ as your salvation? If not, what are you waiting for? Time is running out. Do you know someone who doesn't know Jesus? Don't delay. Pray and ask God how you can best share Christ with them. Do you know what? Now is the time. Today is the day of salvation because we don't know how many days any of us have left. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you and praise you again for who you are. Lord, I thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. I thank you that you loved us so much that you didn't just write us off. Father, I confess I've been guilty of that at times. I've been guilty of just writing something off. Father, help us to never do that because you didn't do that with us. You came to this earth, and Father, it grieves our heart, and Lord, grieves your heart that just as those who were standing and listening to Jesus refused to see who he was, there are many today walking this earth who refuse to see the salvation that you sent to this earth. So, Father, help us to walk that out each and every day. Help us to walk in freedom of Christ. Help us to put on Christ each and every day so that Christ may live in us and through us and be a witness, to help us to be the kind of witness that you want us to be to everyone that we meet. Lord, may our lives be a living testimony of the grace and mercy and forgiveness of who you are and your incredible nature and love for us. Father, help us to do that. And as we rise every morning, may we clothe ourselves fresh and new